What does it mean to write a program for a computer that does not yet exist, to understand not only what a machine can calculate, but what any machine capable of following instructions could, in principle, do? In the 1840s, a mathematician in Victorian England wrote a sequence of instructions for an unbuilt machine, described how that machine could theoretically compose music or generate art if those domains could be expressed in symbolic form, and then passed away at 36, leaving ideas that would not be fully understood for another century. Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hartsteele.
Good evening, Clara.
Ada Lovelace is often described as the first computer programmer, which is accurate but insufficient. She was more precisely the first person to understand what programming fundamentally was, at a time when the machine she was writing for had not been built, and the concept of software did not yet exist. Tonight, we turn to a thinker whose greatest contribution was not a calculation, but a vision. The recognition that a machine capable of following instructions was not a calculator, but something entirely new, engine for symbolic thought. The question is not simply what Ada Lovelace wrote, but what she understood, and why that understanding was so far ahead of everything around her that it had to wait for the 20th century to be fully recognized.
The most important technological revolutions begin as conceptual breakthroughs before they become physical realities. Lovelace's contribution belongs to that category. She articulated the theoretical foundations of general-purpose computing at a time when the technology to realize it was over a century away. The ideas arrived before the machines.
We are speaking about Ada Lovelace, born Augusta Ada Byron in 1815, mathematician, collaborator of Charles Babbage, and the person now widely regarded as the first computer programmer.
The programming language Ada, developed by the United States Department of Defense in the 1970s and 80s and named in her honor, was not a symbolic gesture. It was an acknowledgement that the fundamental concept of what programming is, instructions that tell a general-purpose machine what to do, had been articulated by this woman over a century before the first electronic computer was built.
Then let us begin with the world she was born into and with the extraordinary combination of influences that shaped her mind.
Ada was born in 1815 as the daughter of the poet Lord Byron, one of the most celebrated and scandalous figures of the Romantic era, and Anne Isabella Milbank, a woman of considerable intelligence and mathematical education whom Byron called the Princess of Parallelograms. The marriage lasted barely a year. Byron left England permanently when Ada was a month old, and she never knew him. He passed away in Greece when she was 8. Her mother was determined that Ada would not become like her father. She arranged a rigorous education in mathematics, logic, and science, deliberately steering her away from poetry and imagination. The irony is that this rational education, combined with whatever she had inherited of her father's visionary imagination, produced a mind that could hold both simultaneously. Ada described herself as possessing a poetical science, which she defined as the capacity to see connections between apparently unrelated domains.
So the tension her mother tried to eliminate became the source of her most original insight.
Yes, and here's the first thing we need to correct about the standard account. Ada Lovelace is sometimes depicted primarily as a romantic figure, the daughter of Byron, interesting partly for her famous parentage, and partly for the pathos of her short life. The historical record shows something different. A serious, rigorous, and genuinely original mathematical thinker, whose ideas were taken seriously by the leading scientists of her era, including Charles Babbage, Michael Faraday, and Charles Wheatstone. Ada first encountered Charles Babbage at a social gathering in 1833, when she was 17. Babbage was already working on his difference engine, a mechanical calculator designed to produce mathematical tables without human error, and had begun conceiving of a more ambitious project he called the analytical engine. The meeting between them produced one of the most consequential intellectual collaborations of the 19th century. The difference engine, which Babbage had been attempting to build since 1822, was a machine designed to perform a single category of calculation, the production of mathematical tables, by repeating a fixed sequence of operations. It was impressive in conception and ruinously expensive in construction. The analytical engine, which Babbage designed in the 1830s and 40s but never completed, was something categorically different.
So the difference engine was a single-purpose machine, and the analytical engine was something else entirely.
Yes, the analytical engine was a general-purpose mechanical computer in conception. It had a store, equivalent to what we now call memory, where numbers could be held. It had a mill, equivalent to what we now call a processor, where operations were performed. It could be programmed using punched cards, a technology borrowed from the jacquard loom used in textile manufacture. Different sequences of cards would cause the machine to perform different operations. This was the crucial breakthrough. The same machine given different instructions could do different things. In 1842, an Italian mathematician named Luigi Menabrea published an article in French describing the analytical engine based on lectures Babbage had given in Turin. Ada undertook to translate the article into English for a British scientific journal. Babbage suggested she add her own notes. The notes she produced were 3 times the length of the original article, and contained the most original thinking about computing to appear in the 19th century.
So, the notes she added to a translation became a more significant document than the text she was translating.
Yes. The most famous of her 7 notes, labeled Note G, contains what is now recognized as the first published algorithm intended for implementation on a machine, a detailed sequence of instructions for computing Bernoulli numbers using the analytical engine. Bernoulli numbers are a specific sequence of rational numbers with applications in number theory. The algorithm Ada described was not a simple calculation but a complex procedure involving conditional operations and what we would now call a loop, a sequence of instructions that repeats until a condition is met. The algorithm demonstrates that she had understood not just that the analytical engine could calculate, but how to instruct it to do so in a systematic and generalizable way. She understood the concept of a subroutine, a reusable set of instructions that could be called multiple times within a larger program. She understood that the machine's power came not from any single calculation it performed, but from the ability to chain operations together in sequences that could be changed without rebuilding the machine.
So she understood the logic of programming as a discipline, not just as a technical exercise.
Yes, and her most visionary insight went further still. She wrote that the analytical engine had no power of originating anything. It can only do what we know how to order it to perform. This is a precise statement of a fundamental truth about computation that would be central to the debates of computer science a century later. She also wrote, in the same notes, that the engine could, in principle, compose elaborate and scientific pieces of music of any degree of complexity or extent, given that the relations between musical notes could be expressed in symbolic form and submitted to its operations. This was the conceptual leap that separated her understanding from Babbage's own. Babbage thought of his engine primarily as a mathematical tool. Ada understood that if computation was fundamentally about the manipulation of symbols according to rules, then any domain in which symbols and rules could be specified was in principle accessible to computation. Numbers were simply one domain among many. This is precisely the insight that underlies modern computing, from word processing to music composition to machine learning.
So she understood computation as a universal process rather than a numerical one.
Yes, and this understanding was not shared by most of her contemporaries, including Babbage himself, who never fully articulated the implications of his own design. Ada saw what the machine could mean before anyone else did, which is what makes her status as a foundational figure in the history of computing genuinely earned, rather than merely honorary. Her personal circumstances were difficult throughout her adult life. She suffered from recurring and serious illness, probably involving conditions that would now be identified as neurological and digestive, and the medical treatments of the era, which included laudanum and other opiate preparations, likely contributed to periods of mental instability and addiction. She was ambitious, intellectually restless, and often frustrated by the limitations placed on women's participation in formal scientific life in Victorian England. The intellectual context of Ada's work was shaped by the broader culture of early Victorian science, which was a period of intense optimism about the capacity of rational inquiry to understand and improve the world. The Industrial Revolution had demonstrated that mechanical principles could be applied at large scale with transformative results. The question of whether the same principles could be extended to intellectual labor, to calculation, and eventually to reasoning itself was one that animated some of the period's most original thinkers.
Zohar was working at precisely the moment when the mechanization of thought was first being seriously imagined.
Yes, and her collaboration with Babbage brought her into direct contact with the most concrete attempt to realize that imagination. Babbage was a man of extraordinary technical vision and considerable personal. He was impatient, combative, and often in conflict with the institutions and individuals whose support he needed. Ada served in part as a diplomatic and communicative intermediary, translating his ideas for wider audiences and bringing to the collaboration a clarity of exposition that Babbage himself often lacked. There is a debate among historians of computing about the extent to which the ideas in Ada's notes were truly her own verses derived from her discussions with Babbage. The evidence supports the conclusion that while Babbage reviewed and commented on her notes, the central conceptual contributions, particularly the insight about symbolic manipulation beyond numbers and the detailed algorithm for Bernoulli numbers, were genuinely hers. Babbage himself described her notes as having gone far beyond anything he had produced in explaining the potential of the engine.
So even Babbage recognized that she had understood something about his own machine that he had not fully articulated himself.
Yes, the concept of a loop, a sequence of operations that repeats until a condition is met, which appears in her Bernoulli numbers algorithm, is particularly significant. Loops are one of the fundamental control structures of all programming languages. The ability to repeat a set of instructions a variable number of times, determined by the data rather than fixed in advance, is what allows a program to handle problems of arbitrary size, rather than problems of a predetermined fixed scale. Ada understood and used this concept in the 1840s. The connection between her work and that of Alan Turing a century later is instructive. Turing's 1936 paper on computable numbers, which established the theoretical framework for modern computing, described what he called a universal Turing machine, a hypothetical device that could simulate any other computing machine by reading a description of it. This is the theoretical equivalent of what the analytical engine was designed to do physically. A single machine that could perform different tasks depending on the instructions it received. The conceptual architecture Turing formalized in mathematics, Babbage had sketched in gears, and Ada had understood in words.
So there's a direct line from the analytical engine to Turing's universal machine to the computers that run every piece of software today.
Yes, and Ada Lovelace sits at the beginning of that line, not merely as a historical curiosity, but as the person who first articulated, in precise and publishable form, the conceptual claim that makes the line possible, that a machine capable of following different sequences of instructions is not a specialized tool, but a universal engine whose power comes from what you tell it to do, rather than from what it was built to do. This is what software is, and she understood it, when the machine it would run on had not yet been built.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret Evernight. Margaret, for those who want to understand both Ada Lovelace's life and her ideas, where would you invite them to continue?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with Ada's Algorithm by James Essinger.
So this is a book that traces both the life and the ideas, placing the algorithm within the context of the collaboration and the era that produced it.
Essinger explores the life and legacy of Ada Lovelace, highlighting her collaboration with Charles Babbage and her groundbreaking vision of programmable machines. The book explains how her ideas anticipated modern computing and why she is considered one of the first thinkers to understand the true potential of software, situating her within the scientific culture of Victorian England and showing how far beyond it she was thinking.
Is it accessible to readers without a background in computing or mathematics?
Essinger writes for a general audience and explains the mathematical and computational concepts with care. No prior knowledge of programming or Victorian science is required. The book is as much a biography as a history of ideas, which means the human story of Ada's life carries the technical content rather than the other way around.
So it gives the reader both the person and the idea, without requiring the reader to be a mathematician to follow either.
Precisely. And Essinger takes seriously the debate about the extent of Ada's originality versus Babbage's influence, presenting the evidence fairly rather than simply elevating one at the expense of the other.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
Ada Lovelace passed away in November 1852 at the age of 36 from uterine cancer. She had asked to be buried beside her father, whose grave was in Nottinghamshire, and she was. Her published notes on the analytical engine were her only significant scientific publication. The work she had projected but not completed, a comprehensive theory of the analytical engine's capabilities, was never written. The analytical engine itself was never built in Babbage's lifetime. He produced detailed designs but could not secure the funding to complete the construction, partly because of the enormous cost and partly because of the political fallout from the incomplete and expensive difference. Engine project. A working difference engine was constructed by the Science Museum in London in the 1990s based on Babbage's original plans, demonstrating that the design had been sound. A working analytical engine has not yet been built, though the designs have been studied by computer scientists who have confirmed that it would have functioned as described.
So both the machine and the algorithm she wrote for it existed only on paper during her lifetime.
Yes, the recognition of her work came gradually, and was not complete until the second half of the 20th century. Alan Turing, whose work in the 1930s and 40s established the theoretical foundations of modern computing, was familiar with her notes, and engaged with them explicitly in his 1950 paper on AI, Computing Machinery and Intelligence. He described what he called Lady Lovelace's objection, her statement that the machine could only do what it was instructed to do, and used it as a starting point for thinking about the question of whether machines could think. And the broader legacy of her work is perhaps best understood through the concept of programmability itself. The defining characteristic of modern computers is not their speed or their memory capacity. It is the fact that the same physical machine can run different programs and thereby perform different tasks. This is the idea that the analytical engine embodied, and that Ada understood more fully than anyone else of her era. Every smartphone, every laptop, every server in a data center is a physical realization of the concept she articulated in the notes she added to a translation in 1843.
So the concept of software, of programs that can be changed without changing the machine, was articulated before the machine existed to run them.
Yes, and this is what makes Ada Lovelace's story significant beyond the specific historical facts of who she was and what she wrote. It is a demonstration that conceptual understanding can precede technological realization by generations, and that the ideas which define a future technology are often articulated by people who will never see the technology they are imagining. Newton's mechanics were formulated before the machinery of the Industrial Revolution existed. Maxwell's equations describing electromagnetic waves preceded radio by decades. Ada Lovelace's understanding of general-purpose computation preceded the electronic computer by a century. The modern relevance of her insight is not only historical. The question she identified whether a machine that can manipulate symbols according to rules can, if given the right rules, do anything that a mind can do, is the central question of contemporary artificial intelligence research. She answered it cautiously. The machine can only do what we know how to order it to perform. Whether that limitation is fundamental or merely temporary is the question that is still being worked out in laboratories around the world.
So the question she asked in 1843 is the question that the most advanced computing research is still trying to answer.
Yes, and she asked it with a precision and a depth that has not been surpassed in the framing of the problem, only in the technical resources brought to bear on it. A woman in Victorian England, working with a mathematician on a machine that was never built, wrote a set of notes that defined the theoretical horizon of computing for the next 180 years. That is the most accurate summary of Ada Lovelace's contribution, and it is extraordinary enough without embellishment.
Thank you for staying with us tonight, and thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the daughter of Byron who became a mathematician, the algorithm written for an unbuilt machine, and the insight that computation is not about numbers but about the manipulation of symbols according to rules that can be changed without changing the machine.
Ada Lovelace reminds us that the most consequential ideas are often the ones that arrive before anyone else has the tools to test them, and that understanding what a thing could be is sometimes more important than building it.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.